Hey, my name is Nick Briz, and this is netnet, and this is going to be an introduction to HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, as well as an introduction to some of the core concepts behind the World Wide Web, and a continued introduction to this platform, to netnet.studio, which I introduced in the last video that I posted. We're going to be diving deeper into specifically netnet's different learning modes. And anytime we're learning something on netnet, usually that begins by clicking on netnet's face and opening up the learning guide. This is where you'll find actually that interactive tutorial that I posted in the last video right here, the orientation tutorial. But up here in the table of contents, we've got some hyperlinks to lessons on the fundamental languages of the World Wide Web, the most foundational of which is HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language. That's what we're diving into in this video. HTML is part of a family of languages known as markup languages. We'll talk about a couple others a little bit later. But what markup languages do is structure content. They organize data. And in our case, HTML is used to organize the content of a web page. By itself, it looks a little boring, kind of like a Google Doc or like Craigslist or something like that. But we can change the way web pages look and feel by using CSS, or cascading style sheets. This is a whole separate language that you can use to change the colors, the typography, the layout, but we'll get into that in a future video. There's also JavaScript, which we'll also get into in a future video, but I'll just say briefly that this is a programming language. Again, there are loads of programming languages and you can use a few of them on the web, but JavaScript is the web's de facto programming language. It can be used to take a web page and turn it more into a web app or a piece of software. JavaScript adds interactive, generative, and other sort of dynamic dimensions to our web projects. So together, these three form the most foundational languages. But HTML is at the core of all web pages. There are artists who create their work entirely out of pure CSS code and others that create work entirely out of pure JavaScript. But even in those instances, you still need an HTML page. You still need an HTML file to put that code into, and even just a little bit of HTML to kind of frame or contain your CSS or JavaScript code. So even if your practice might find its way into one of these corners where you exclusively use one of these other languages, it's important to know what HTML is at the very least, because it is the foundation within which we do all of the other creative stuff, or everything really, on the World Wide Web. Before we dive into the HTML details here, I do want to point out something that's very important to understand, which is that we do not need netnet or any code editor or any piece of software really to write and read HTML. HTML is a language, just like human languages like English or Spanish or Korean. Once you learn to read and write it, you become literate in that language, and you can use anything to read and write that language. Just to really kind of prove this point, I wrote a web page with pen and paper, like I would in English. And this is a web page. I mean, it's just the idea of a web page right now. It's just that code written on paper. In order to render a web page, we need a web browser. I'll come back to that in a second. But this is a valid web page. I took a photo of that paper and put it on my computer. I'm running Mac OS, which has something called OCR built into it, or optical character recognition, which means if you have a photo of handwritten text, you can actually highlight that handwritten text, which means I can copy it. And as I can copy it, I can paste it in any app that lets me write text, the most basic of which is TextEdit. The OCR didn't do a perfect job of converting my handwritten text into text characters, but with a few little edits, it's pretty much there. So here we go. Here's what I wrote in paper, now in TextEdit. Is this a website? Ooh, almost. It's a .txt file, and websites are .html files. But if I save this as a .html file, now I've got a website. The content is exactly the same as it was before. The difference is the extension. Now it's .html. And that difference changes the way it looks as an icon on the desktop. It almost looks like like that red website actually. If I double click the TXT file, TextEdit opens, because on Mac OS, it knows to open up any file with a .txt extension in TextEdit. But if I double click this HTML file, the default app for that type of file format on my computer is Firefox. So if I double click this, it now opens on Firefox and it renders that code as a web page. Now that web page has a very harsh red color, so let's edit that. I'm going to change this word red to Rebecca purple. Now hit Command S to save that. And now my icon looks purple. And if I come back to the web page and hit the refresh, and now I see that much more pleasant shade of purple. Now this web page is sitting on my computer. You cannot access this web page because you do not have access to my computer. But I can make at least that part of my computer accessible to you by running a web server. So a web server is sort of the other piece to the web browser. Web browsers are used to request websites and render them, and web servers listen for those requests and send the copy of those websites to whoever's running the browser that requested it. Just like there are loads of different browsers that we can use, here's my collection of browsers ordered from favorite to least favorite. There are also loads of servers that you can use. And just like you can download most of these for free, you can also download servers for free. You could also create your own browser if you want, or create your own server, which is what I did. This is a little app I wrote called Serve, which I can use to run a server. I'm not going to run a server right now because I don't want to fall down this tangent too deeply, but I'll just say that if I did run that server on my computer and adjust a couple settings on my router, then that page that I just made, which I'll remind you I wrote by hand, would become available to you if you typed in the IP address or web address of my computer into your address bar. You could use any browser you want, type in the address, it would send a request to my computer, here my laptop. My server would pick up that request, copy that HTML file, and send it back to you, and then you would see the page rendered on your computer. That is the web in a nutshell. There is no company, country, centralized server or data center that owns and operates the web. This is a point I made in the last video, but hopefully this is becoming a bit more concrete with this example. The web is just HTML pages written in HTML code by anybody. If you take that web page and you put it on a computer that's running a server, which could be your laptop, though most people prefer to upload their HTML pages to a data center and have the data center run the server so that they can use their laptop for laptop things. But the point here is any computer connected to the internet can run a server. Any computer connected to the internet can run a browser. There are any number of servers and browsers that you can use. And by creating a web page that's running on a computer with a server, you've now published your work to the web. That's what it means to publish work to the web. You don't need an account. You don't need any special company. You just need a computer running a server, and now anybody who has a browser can send a request to that computer and visit your web page. This is, in theory, I think some maybe simple but hard to kind of wrap our heads around. So it's something I'm going to be hammering in throughout this series of videos to make sure that we do not forget. And I'll come back to that at the end of this video, because right now we'll dive back into netnet, but I don't want us to conflate netnet with the web. Netnet is just a space that we can use to learn about and create the web, especially if we're artists and especially if we're getting started for the first time. That's sort of what this platform is designed to kind of guide you into this other platform, the wider platform that this app and so many and every other app that we use online are built on, which is the World Wide Web. And we're going to start by doing a guided introduction. Before I click on this, though, I do want to mention that we do have these docs, netnet.studio/docs. On this page, there's a Dear Students section that introduces some of the basics to netnet.studio. At the very bottom, there's this section on the Learning Guide, which again is this widget that we opened up a moment ago. And it mentions that there are a few different learning modes. There's the interactive tutorials, for example, which was like the orientation that I uploaded in the last video. There are also these guided templates and demos. I'll talk about that in the next couple of videos. And then there are these guided intros. That's what this is. If we click on Start Intro to HTML, it launches one of netnet's guided introductions. A guided intro is essentially a conversation that you have with netnet. We'll start that conversation here in a second. And that conversation is usually accompanied by some widget. In this case, we have this little presentation widget where netnet's going to be writing some code that's going to be getting rendered in the background of the page. But there's other sorts of widgets and other sorts of guided intros besides the ones for these languages. Here on netnet, we've got guided intros for how to manage project files once you start working on projects. We've got little guided intros where netnet teaches you how to version a project and use Git and GitHub through a terminal, and all sorts of other things that you'll get to eventually, and I'll post some videos about. But all of which is to say that guided intro is a conversation you have with netnet that introduces you to some topic, in this case HTML. And that introduction can go in different directions. For example, this first passage says, the most foundational coding language of the web is hypertext markup language, or HTML. Like all markup languages, HTML is defined by a collection of elements. The widget below displays an example of what an element looks like. That's what we see here. An element usually has a name, and then it has these greater than or less than brackets on either side. Now here we can say go on, or if I'm curious, I can say there are other markup languages, and I can click on that to go on a little tangent. So let's for a moment go on this tangent. Yes, there are other markup languages. There's MathML, which is used to structure mathematical notation and then render sort of mathematical notation in a document. There's SVG, which we talked about in the last video. Feel free to go back and rewatch that. But there was an SVG widget that I opened up where we had graphical interfaces, the kind you would see in apps like Figma or Inkscape or Illustrator. And as we were creating different visual graphics, this markup language, what's called SVG, was getting rendered behind the scenes. Similarly, when we use, say, a word processing app like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, what Google Docs is doing when we use the graphical interface, like when we create headers or format our text, behind the scenes, it's creating HTML, or hypertext markup language. And we'll see what that looks like in a second. But there's all sorts of other markup languages, including markup languages created by artists like GML or Graffiti markup language created by the Graffiti Research Lab. This is one of my favorite new media art projects. It's really sort of a meta project because it's a file format, GML file format. What GML does is record the movements of a graffiti writer. So they created applications that can track the movement of graffiti writers as they write on a wall, and then it generates a file, a .gml file from that movement, which can then be rendered back out in a lot of different ways. For example, this project takes GML files and controls a robotic arm and can rewrite that graffiti on a wall. Or this project takes that GML file and 3D prints a sculpture from the movement that the graffiti artist made. Or this one right here, one of my favorite projects in this collection, iWriter, where these artists hacked a PS2 camera to some lens frames so that you can write graffiti by moving your eyes around. And the reason they did that was actually for this artist, this graffiti writer, Tempt 1, who is stricken with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, which essentially affects the motor functions of his arms and legs, which he is no longer able to move, but he is able to move his eyes. And so with this sort of hacked camera, they track his eye movements and generate these GML files, these graffiti markup language files. Then those artists will go out into the streets of LA and play those GML files through a projector, essentially allowing Temp 1 to write graffiti on building walls from his hospital bed just by moving his eyes. And at the center of that project, and so many of these projects, is a markup language, one created by artists called Graffiti markup language. I will stop there because I can dive deep into that and go on a tangent. I'll leave links in the description below if you want to learn more about those projects. But for now, we'll just say there's a family of markup languages. They all do the same thing. They structure data, and they all share the same syntax. We're going to be learning that syntax, but we're already seeing a little bit here, like these brackets. And they all have elements, but what makes them unique or different is the type of elements that they have. HTML is going to have elements for creating documents, or the contents, the components of a document. We'll see that in a second. SVG has elements for creating the components of a graphic. GML has elements for tracking the movements of a graffiti writer. So that's what netnet is explaining now, is that we have these less than or greater than symbols, these brackets which define an element. We can ask netnet more about syntax. I'm going to keep moving forward, but I'll remind you here that if you visit netnet.studio yourself in your browser and you open the learning guide, you can launch this intro to HTML yourself, and you can choose how you want to navigate this interactive lesson or any of the interactive lessons on the platform. But I'll just click go on. where netnet explains that there actually isn't any element named element, like it says here in this graphic. This is just a sort of example. If you want to see a real HTML element, this is an example of one, the HR, or horizontal rule, which creates a horizontal line across the page. If we were to have one of these elements, if I had written bracket HR greater than symbol in my text file and had saved that as an HTML page and had opened that in the browser as we did earlier, we would see a blank page with a single line across it horizontally. What netnet has done behind the scenes is actually written multiple HTML elements, one after the other, which is why we have multiple lines in the page behind us. Now, as netnet explains, not all elements get visibly rendered on our page. For example, the meta element is used to create metadata, or information about our page. So instead of showing up in the actual rendered page, which is why our page is blank right now, this data appears in other places. So if we were to publish our page to the web, which again just means putting it on a computer that's running a server so that someone else can access it on their browser, and it shows up on, say, Google search results, the information we put in metadata is what you would see in those results. You might also see the meta information in those little share cards on social media or in bookmarks or in other places like that. We'll dive into some concrete examples of the meta tag in use in the next video. Other elements appear differently, as netnet explains, depending on how you write them. Consider this input element. By default, it creates a text input, which I can click on and type stuff into here. That's what the way that you create one of these inputs in a web page is just writing this input element. Now, the type of input element we want, we can actually change it by adding this type attribute, this little extra piece of code here. Right now, nothing has changed. It's still a text input, and that's because the text type is the default for the input element. And so we didn't need to specify that we wanted a type of text. But if we were to change it, we can change the type of input we have. We'll do that in a second. For now, a bit more terminology to keep in mind is that what we've written here is called an attribute. So we have an element. In this case, we have the input element. That's the name of this element, is the input. The element is defined by these brackets. And within the element's bracket, after the name, but before this greater than symbol, we can add attributes. Here we've added a single attribute, what's called the type attribute, which we can use to change the type of UI element that gets rendered to our page. Attributes have their own syntax. So every attribute has a name. In this case, this one's called type. And that name is always followed by an equal sign. And then within quotes, we write the value of that attribute. In this case, the value is text. So the equal sign, the quotes, the brackets, this is what we call syntax. All markup languages have this syntax. What makes the markup languages different is their vocabulary, the specific list of elements and attributes associated with that language. If we change the value of our input, we get different types of input elements. So right now, netnet's creating a whole bunch of input elements and changing their type values so that we can see what those look like on the page. So for example, range will render one of these little sliders. If we say type checkbox, we get these little checkboxes. If we say type radio, we get these little circular radio buttons. If we say type color, we get these little color widgets, which we can use to pick different colors. All of these are input elements that netnet is adding to the page. The difference is just the value of their type attribute. Now, up to this point, like netnet mentions, we've been only looking at elements that consist of a single tag, what are known as singleton or void elements. But really, most elements consist of a pair of tags, or what we call tags. Specifically, these elements have opening tags and closing tags. So here's an example, the H1, or the sort of level 1 header element. We've put the words my website between the opening and closing tags, which is why we're getting the word my website rendered on the page as a level 1 header. So if you were using Google Docs and you chose from the you chose to make a piece of text a header, especially a level 1 header, it would get rendered into something like this. Behind the scenes, what Google Docs is doing is placing that text you wrote between an opening and closing H1 tag. Something to mention here, since we are learning about terminology, that's kind of one of the big points of this particular lesson and this video, is that sometimes people will use the term tag and element interchangeably, kind of like synonyms, which is fine colloquially. As long as somebody understands what you're saying, that's the whole point of language. But technically, just so that we understand the difference, this entire bit of code is known as an element, and the element, which can consist of a single tag, but oftentimes consists of 2 tags, the opening and the closing tag, which are identical if not for this one slash, this one piece of syntax, which is what denotes the closing tag from the opening tag. Now netnet has taken that same piece of content, that text, my website, and placed it between 2 different opening and closing tags. Another way of saying that is placing it within a different element, the P or paragraph element. So we still see that content on our page, the words my website, but they're smaller now. They just look like normal text, as though if I just started to write in my Google Doc and didn't change the formatting. That's what P elements are for, paragraph elements are for. Notice the syntax is the same as before. What has changed is the name of the element. So both within the opening tag and the closing tag, H1 has been swapped with P, and now this element becomes a paragraph element. Now we've done the same thing, but we've changed our paragraph element into an A element, also known as an anchor element. So instead of P, we see the keyword A inside the opening and closing tags. And on the page, it looks exactly the same for now, but the A tag is a very special element. In fact, in many ways, it defines this medium, this space, this platform, the World Wide Web, because it can use a very special attribute, the href attribute. Now that we've added an href attribute to this A element, it looks a little different than it did before. It now looks like a link, and that's because this is how we create links on the web using A elements. We take a piece of content, we put an opening and closing A tag around it, and then we add the href attribute. Just like the input element before, attributes go within the opening tag. So within the brackets, after the keyword, here the element is called A, and before the closing bracket of the opening tag. Then we can write the name of the attribute, in this case href, followed by an equal sign, and then within quotes, the value of the attribute. In this case, the value of the href attribute is the URL of the website you want the page to go to when that link gets clicked. And so if I click here on this page, it now jumps to the netizen.org website. It's something really important to mention here. We're kind of getting to the end of this lesson, but I want to kind of point out that this is a very simple piece of code. You could probably write your own links now, open up a text editor, start writing some links, and save it as an HTML page, double click that HTML page, and now you've got a website with links in it on your browser. Try that out. But I also want us to understand how consequential this concept of a link is central to the World Wide Web. It's why it's called the World Wide Web. The web, as I mentioned before, is just HTML pages that people have made. And they've taken those HTML pages and they've put them on computers that are running servers, which means other computers running browsers can request them, can visit those web pages by sending requests to the servers, and which send the HTML pages back to the browsers. But what makes it a web is links. The fact that we can link our web pages to other web pages, together forming the World Wide Web. This is what makes this platform special, that we can kind of explore and navigate it by jumping from one page to another. It's the power behind this very simple piece of code threatens even the business models of large big tech companies, which is why I can think of at least a couple social media platforms, which remember are just web pages on the World Wide Web, that limit your use of links. Even some platforms that are supposed to be about user-generated content, they're supposed to be platforms that allow other people to more easily add content to the web without having to write the code themselves. Instead, you could sign up for an account on somebody else's platform and then post content that way. But they'll prevent you from being able to post links. Why? Because those platforms want to keep you on their little corner of the World Wide Web. They don't want you to click on a link and leave and start exploring the wider World Wide Web. And so very simple piece of code, but very consequential. And we see it in the politics of the platforms that we use every day, even if it's invisible and subtle to us. That concludes the basics. With that, you now know all of the syntax to markup languages in general and to HTML. From here on out, it's about how do we combine different elements together to create web pages? How do we structure a web page? What are the other elements that we can use? What's the rest of the vocabulary? What are the other attributes that we can use? We're going to dive into that in the next video. If I click on this link, which I'll save for the next video, netnet is going to launch into a different learning mode. It's going to launch into a guided template. So we'll save that for the next video. But I do want to recap. I do want to remind us again here that while netnet is a great place to create and learn stuff, we don't need any special fancy software to take part in the web. Like this page I created a moment ago, we can use anything to write HTML code. And if you right mouse click on this page, and really right mouse, you can do this on any web page, we see this view page source option, and that'll show us the actual HTML code behind the rendered output that the browser created for us. NetNet's just going to make that a little bit easier. So with that, we'll jump into the next lesson.